So this is lecture number 7, and the topic is Document Acts and the Ontology of Social Reality. And you all know what documents are. These are just a few examples. I'm generalizing a little bit. So from the present point of view, a clock is a document. And I'm not going to talk about clocks, but they are, ontologically speaking, a very interesting subject. The reason why they are documents is because they contain symbols of the sort which we find in other documents. They are used for certain purposes. They are sources of knowledge. And we will find that most of what we have to say about documents of the more traditional sort, such as newspapers or recipes, will apply, in part at least, to the more peripheral examples listed here, such as clocks. Or a policeman's badge is another example of a document in the sense that I'm understanding it. A label saying graduate assistants on the door across the corridor is a document in this sense. So the policeman's badge and the label both contain symbols which are used also in more traditional documents. They are sources of knowledge and so forth. And then there are different types of documents. So there are literary documents, there are newspapers, there are scientific publications, there are legal codes, there are reports about legal processes, which are legal documents of a different sort, and so on and so on. And then your passport or your driver's license are also documents. Bills, receipts that you get when you pay a bill, they are also documents. So I hope all of this is trivial. I'm not doing rocket science here. And now, there is, as I guess all the philosophers in the room will know, a very important branch of philosophy called speech act theory. And speech act theory is an attempt to classify the different ways in which we can use language in order to bring about different sorts of effects. So we've talked a lot about promising. Promising is a core example of a speech act. And the very name speech act suggests that speech act theory is about acts of speaking. But the French translate speech act as acte du langage, which means language act. And if you look at the main literature on speech acts, which we will mention later on, then very often you find incidental suggestions that what is here being said about speech acts would apply also to acts which don't involve speech, but which do involve documents. For instance, signing a contract is very like the speech act of promising, but signing a contract is something that you do not with speech, but with ink and paper. So what I want to talk about are the reasons why we might suppose that there are interesting differences between speech acts and document acts. And some of these interesting differences will turn out to be quite important for understanding complex institutions such as marriage or government or law or finance. And so understanding the ways in which these kinds of institutions involve document acts will help us, first of all, to understand the role of documents, but also help us to understand the differences between document acts and speech acts. All right, so you can do things with documents that you can't do with speech acts. You can burn documents, for instance. You can't burn a speech act. And you can shell the document. And you can steal a document. You can steal dollar bills. Dollar bills are documents from the present perspective. So there's nothing directly analogous in the realm of speech acts to these kinds of activities. These are things which you can do with a document. Now, when you take specific kinds of documents, you can do more things. So if you're dealing with literary documents, you can do things like read them. You can't read all paper documents, or you wouldn't sensibly read all paper documents. You wouldn't read a telephone book in the way in which you might read a work of literature, in other words, for pleasure. Or you can criticize or recommend or publish or perform even. Again, all of those things are things which don't apply to speech acts, and they don't apply to all documents, but they do apply to literary documents. But now, one of the main contributions to the philosophical literature on speech act theory is a book with the title How to Do Things with Words. Now, this is about speech acts, how to do things with words like excuse me, or you are a jerk, or and so on. What we're talking about now will include also how to do things with documents. Now, documents can do things which involve other documents. For instance, they can cite other documents. So you can link documents together. Documents can provide evidence. For instance, evidence about what time it is, or about what the person who is named on this document, which also contains a photograph of the person, looks like. Or a document might contain data which is derived from a scientific experiment, which provides evidence for the truth of a certain hypothesis. If you are being given instructions by your commanding officer, then you may request that your command be documented on a piece of paper in order to protect yourself against liability, for instance. Such things happen not just in military circumstances, but also in hospitals, for instance. A document may be used in order to document a right, for instance, the right to drive on the highways, which is the right documented by a driver's license. You can use documents in order to document an obligation, for instance, when you owe somebody some money. And then money itself exists in the form of documents. It exists in other forms too, but it exists in the form of documents, and those documents serve as media of exchange. All right, and now similarly, if we take a scientific document, there are various things that you can do with that document. You can test it for correctness, for instance. You can revise it, and so forth. And when you're dealing with bureaucratic documents, then you can do things like stamp the document, or sign the document, or co-sign the document. Now, these are things which you can't do with speech acts. These are things which transform speech acts into something which is more permanent, something which can be stored and then later on retrieved. A speech act is evanescent. It exists for the time when the speech act is being performed. The participants in the speech act may remember the speech act, but their memories may fail, trust may break down, and so one of the reasons why we have document acts is so that we can have documents which can document speech acts in such a way that evidence can be provided of the fact that the speech act was performed at a later stage in case of dispute. So these are things which documents do, which speech is in need of in certain circumstances. And we're going to focus primarily, precisely on those kinds of documents, the documents which are involved in what we might think of as bureaucratic or legal ethical situations where there is the possibility of dispute, there is the need for checking, there is a possibility of liability, where we want to be able to document that certain commitments were made, or that certain processes occurred, or that certain processes were observed at an earlier time, when in a later time some disputes arise. So I'm going to be using the word document primarily to relate to this narrow class of documents. And you can think of them also as time-sensitive documents, which are important for things like commerce, law, or medicine. And so I'm not going to be interested in novels or recipes that you might find in a cookery book. They're documents, but they're not going to be documents which have the interesting features which I want to focus on in what follows. All right, are there any questions so far? Okay. All right, so if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, then there are 4 meanings of document. Document derives from the Latin word for teaching. So a document is a lesson learned. But then the later meanings are that which serves to show or prove something. So a document is something which documents or proves something. And then when writing was invented, the word was used in a still narrower sense to mean something written or inscribed which proves something, which furnishes evidence. So title deeds are very important kinds of documents because they prove that you own your home, for instance. Now, the history of philosophy for a long time ignored speech acts. There are very few occurrences in the literature of philosophy until the 20th century where people consider the ways in which we use language in non-descriptive ways. For instance, to promise or to congratulate or to marry or to baptize or to command or to request. Those uses of language were regarded as trivial. Maybe everything I say today is trivial, but I think there is a place in philosophy for discussing even certain very obvious kinds of truths. I actually think that these kinds of rather obvious kinds of truths are going to be increasingly important because I think that the role of document acts in the world is expanding tremendously because paper is being replaced with electrons. And we're going to, as I will show as the lecture goes on, we're becoming more and more involved with systems of e-document acts. But it took until the 20th century for philosophers to start thinking about speech acts, the varieties of ways of doing things with words. Very few philosophers, even today, have thought about document acts. And very few philosophers have thought about these kinds of questions. So what is a contract, or what is a signature? Or what is a credit card? So Kant has nothing to say about questions like this. Plato did do a certain amount of reflection on writing, but generally speaking, these are not the kinds of questions that philosophers have found important. I find these very intriguing kinds of questions. So if you consider the question, what is a credit card number, I think that a credit card number, first of all, is not a number. For instance, it doesn't have prime divisors. You can't add it to another credit card number and get a third credit card number. You can't perform arithmetical operations on credit card numbers. If you think you can, that's a category mistake. If your credit card number is digit for digit identical with my social security number, then that would be interesting. But still, we would not be dealing with one and the same number because they're not numbers. All right. Now, as I think you all know by now, ontology is rapidly becoming accepted as the discipline which considers questions like that. And this is an interesting it's an interesting document, I guess, which is the chart of the rise of ontology as a word used in books published between 1700 and 2008, as contrasted with the much earlier rise in the late 19th century, in use of the word metaphysics. So metaphysics is the red curve. And as you can see, metaphysics is going downhill. Unfortunately, Google doesn't give you any information beyond 2008, but I'm assuming that metaphysics is about here, and ontology is about here. And so there is some numerical evidence for this. If you look at, well, you can't do it anymore, but fortunately, I was already interested in these kinds of questions in 2004, and so I collected some data. And in the year 2004, Heidegger talks about ontology. No one knows what he means, but he talks about ontology. And if you Google ontology and Heidegger in 2004, you get 58,000 hits. If you Google ontology and information systems, you are already getting 702,000 hits. And then if you go to 2012, and in the meantime, Heideggerians have all bought laptops. So they've started to populate the web, and they're already up to 1.91 million hits. But by then, ontology and information systems was up to 5.14 million hits. And Heidegger is ahead of Aristotle by 2012. This is sort of sad. But now in 2015, Aristotle is once again in the forefront. So they both dropped. I think that's just because of Google using new algorithms. I don't think you can read any significance in the drop. But ontology in philosophy is very high. Ontology in database is even higher. Ontology in software is even higher. But ontology in information systems has gone down relative to the other items. But still, ontology and Heidegger is, well, it's gone down to a reasonable number, but I don't think that you can read anything in that, as I said. All right, so what we're doing is ontology, and we are going to be looking at the question ontology in software in a minute. But first of all, we're doing the ontology of documents and of related artifacts. Now, we talked in earlier classes, when we were dealing with duties, obligations, and so forth, about the mutually correlated claims and obligations which are associated with acts, for instance, of making a promise. So that we make the promise, the promisor acquires an obligation to realize the content of the promise, and the promisee acquires a claim on the promisor to realize that content, to do whatever was promised. Now, speech act theory, in the narrow sense of speech act theory focusing on speech, is a perfectly appropriate approach where we're dealing with small village societies, or with small groups of friends, or with small groups of family members, because there, or with lovers outside Californian University. Because there, speech is enough. You don't need to document the agreements that you make, because everyone trusts everybody and everyone remembers, because they're small-scale commitments were being made. But when we extend commitments to include large organizations, or to include people in different villages or different towns or different countries, then speech is not enough. Speech is not enough, A, because memory doesn't survive forever, but more importantly, B, because you can't trust those other guys. They come from Delaware. And so you need to have documents in order that the systems of mutually correlated claims and obligations work to support social organization in the way that they are supposed to work to support social organization. And so John Searle was one of the creators of speech act theory. He wrote a very important book called Speech Acts. He created, or anyway, made a large contribution to creating the discipline of social ontology as a branch of philosophy by extending the theory of speech acts to a theory of institutions. And what we're doing today is very much in the spirit of John Searle, except where he gets things wrong. So Searle has this thesis, which I call the Searle Thesis, that when we perform speech acts, such as promising or marrying, we change the world. So we have two people, and then we marry them, and then we have a husband and a wife, for instance. And we thereby bring about a new kind of relation, a new kind of bond between two people. Or we may bring about claims, obligations, rights, authority relations, and so forth, that we talked about in the earlier classes. So Searle's thesis is that speech acts bring about new kinds of social entities. And this is a quote from a recent book by Searle called Making the Social World, who talks about this creative activity, creating a name, for instance, when you name a ship, as a kind of magic. So we can't create life, but we have a similar remarkable capacity. We can create boundaries, kings, and corporations by saying something equivalent to, let this be a boundary, let the oldest son be the king, or let there be a corporation. So this is magic. Ontological fecundity. And I think that he is... So it's not really magic. I think we can understand this. The reason why he calls it magic is because he doesn't actually believe that boundaries and kings and corporations exist. And the reason why he doesn't believe that they exist is because he is a naturalist, which means that he thinks that the only things which exist are things like molecules, fields of energy, or physical processes, such as the process of me generating an audio-acoustic blast, which is now stimulating your eardrums and sending signals to your retina. No, not to your retina, to your brain. And then your brain is processing those signals, and you respond by yawning, which is what we were doing just now. That's just physics. Now, the king is a human being, and human beings are part of physics. So we have no problem with kings as human beings, but we do have problems with kingship. And boundaries between countries are not made of physical particles, and they're not physical force fields. And corporations are even more remote from what might be captured by a physical theory. So Searle has a real problem with the very entities which his theory is supposed to be about. And we will see what that problem is as we go along. But nevertheless, he is a great philosopher, and everything that we do is in his spirit. So, the question for document act theory is that we have long-term commitments, long-term obligations. And the speech act is an evanescent process. So how do we keep these obligations in being when we need obligations across large societies or across long periods of time? So in the local case, the small village, we have memories and trust. But in the non-local case, we need documents. That's the thesis. Now, I believe that one of the very first people, perhaps the first person, to recognize this was a Peruvian economist by the name of Hernando de Soto, who is the director of the Institute for Liberty and Democracy in Lima. And we organized a meeting here in Buffalo on Searle and de Soto's work. And the meeting was really attempting to draw attention to the fact that speech act theory needs to be extended by document act theory because of what de Soto showed in this book, which is called The Mystery of Capital, and which it has been a bestseller. It's been very influential on many important people. So one of de Soto knows personally at least 130 heads of state, including Bill Clinton, who is a close friend. He works with heads of state in order to implement the ideas which he describes in this book. And basically the ideas are ways in which we can create document systems which will create modern social institutions, even in areas where people are poor, do not have property rights, are, because they don't have property rights, forced to spend a lot of energy squatting on their land, because if they don't squat on the land, then someone else will come and occupy it. And so in Peru initially, and then in many other countries since then, De Soto has been showing how you can create systems of property rights by giving poor, illiterate people documents. Now you can imagine it's quite hard to do that because they're illiterate. And so they don't understand why this document should have this important power to give them certain kinds of abilities. For instance, they can now get legal electricity. Without the title deed, they had to bribe somebody, or they had to create an illegal conduit through which electricity could flow from someone else, or either with the knowledge or without the knowledge of the person they were stealing the electricity from. Now they can get legal electricity, they can get insurance, they can get mortgages, they can get police protection. They have to pay taxes on the other, which is not, it's not all good. And he showed by actually doing it that this system works. And the first and most conspicuous benefit of this kind of process was that girls increased in their literacy rate, because it was the girls who used to have to stay at home squatting on the property, and so they couldn't go to school. But now the girls can go to school because no one needs to squat. All right, so he showed that capitalism generally is based on the existence of documents. And when for instance, you have a factory, then you own the factory, but you want to buy machinery. And so you go to the bank and you say, lend me the value of the factory, I will give you the title deed for the factory, and you lend me the money to buy machinery, and then 3 years later I've used the machinery, I can pay back the loan for the factory, and now I own both the factory and the machinery. So that is a true magical power of documents. You can't do that unless you have the document which can be stored in the bank. Now the entire infrastructure of stocks and shares is based upon this idea that we can represent the value of a factory on a piece of paper. Because now we can say, well, this value of this factory can be divided into 1,000 fractions, and each one of those 1,000th of a factory's worth of value can be bought by 1,000 different people, so that they can all share in the growth in value of the factory over time, in the process of investing their money when they are working, so that they can then have money when they're retired in the form of pensions. So the Western industrial society is based upon the fungibility of capital, which comes about because physical capital is represented in documents which allow physical capital to be divided among many different owners and sold and bought in such a way that the resources that you need to expand capital and improve capital flow to the most valued locales, or the most valued experts, or the most valued ways of addressing needs of people who can buy things. So De Soto generalized Searle's thesis by saying document systems create institutional orders, those institutional orders upon which modern society rests. Primarily the orders of capitalism, stocks, shares, insurance, and so forth. Now there are two other dimensions to this. First of all, speech acts only allow communication between people. So I guess we can perform speech acts nowadays with robots. But leaving aside robots, speech acts are about human communication. Document acts allow people to communicate with organizations. So you give the title deed to the bank. You don't just promise the bank that you'll give them your house if you don't pay the loan. You give them the title deed to your house. You are communicating with the organization in an organizational way, not in the way that you communicate with people. And then, of course, documents are media for communication between organizations themselves, and that's the basis of bureaucracy. Yes?
to clarify, when you say robots, it's software in general.
So yes. Yeah. So I said robots because I was thinking that you could, in principle, make a promise to a robot, I suppose.
Yeah, no.
I haven't thought that through yet, but...
because you can send voice command to computers.
Yeah. So, we have to think about those kinds of questions. So I think that there is a new frontier of ontology, and that new frontier of ontology is understanding how we extend what we know about speech acts and document acts to apply to what we are increasingly confronted by, namely analogous situations in which the counterparty is not a human being and it's not an organization, it's a machine. And it may be, an entire system of machines called the internet. We just don't know yet how we are going to understand what that makes possible in the ontological way in which we do, I think, understand how speech acts make claims and obligations possible. All right. So now what De Soto is saying is that with the invention of documented claims and obligations, a new dimension of reality comes into existence. It means that you can get the benefit of your factory twice. Once, you can run your machines inside it. The other, you can use it as security on a loan. So you're twice as rich because we have pieces of paper. Now, that's an amazing phenomenon. And I believe that he was the first person to see that the role of documents, the role of representations of value, not just value of factories, value of people, value of houses, value of farms, is the source of the success of modern capitalism. All right, so bank accounts, stock shares, bonds, mortgages, credit cards, and so on. All of these form document systems, which are networks involving claims and obligations, but millions of them going in all directions and changing potentially from minute to minute. So the stock exchange is changing from millisecond to millisecond. So, new types of distributed ownership, new types of legal accountability. So the fact that you now own the land means that you're accountable if something bad happens because of what happens on that land. For instance, you steal electricity. If you steal electricity and it can be proved that the electricity was stolen by somebody on your land, then you are accountable. And also it makes possible new types of business organization, which we will talk about a little bit. So what De Soto has been doing, he has been trying to accelerate the growth of Western institutions in poor parts of the world by creating document systems very, very rapidly. Now, it took a lot of work. It took years for it to work in Peru. Now it goes more quickly as he applied similar strategies in other kinds of cultures. Each time he sends his team into the relevant country, they examine the country, they talk to the people who live there, the poor people who are going to benefit from what he will then try to introduce. He discusses the optimal way in which they can guarantee their rights. For instance, in areas where big mining companies want to mine, he wants to bring about a situation where the people will have property rights and they can determine on the basis of their own interests what the mining companies will be able to do. All right. Yes.
I can say that, for example, Telefonica record could be a document.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So one of the interesting features of the poor societies where De Soto works is that they nearly all have multiple, well-developed, illegal cell phone networks. And they work very well. They provide banking services, they provide access to information about potential business partners that they wouldn't have otherwise, because people just don't know what the people in the next village are capable of and what their reliability is and so forth. But cell phone banking on the basis of illegal cell phone networks is a huge phenomenon in many poor countries. And that's documents in the e-document sense, but it's fairly clear how cell phone banking is just a generalization of more traditional document-based banking.
Because a telephone typing could be evidence.
Yeah, exactly. Process. All of the things which we find on paper documents, we now can find on our cell phone, just that they move more quickly. And we won't need credit cards in the future, we just have our cell phone. All right. So, we're going to try and build document act theory, and that we're going to need some basic distinctions. So, we can think of a document as just a standalone entity. So you make a photocopy of a scientific paper. But in fact, very many documents are tied to an entire network of other documents. So even a scientific paper has footnotes, which link it to other scientific papers, which have footnotes, which link them to other scientific papers. And so the unit, which is the scientific paper, is really an atom within a gigantic molecule. And each of the other atoms within the gigantic molecule are connected to yet further atoms within other gigantic molecules. And that's true not just of scientific publications, it's true of commercial documents, it's true of legal documents, it's true of government documents. Documents are parts of networks which interrelate them to other documents. And this is true also with e-documents when an email has attachments, for instance, as well as a string of precursor emails and so forth. Now, so that's the first distinction. You can either view the document of itself, or you can view the document as part of a larger network. And sometimes the larger network is indispensable to understanding the document. But then you can also have document templates, which are either empty or filled in. So the document contains cells. This is the more common on the screen nowadays than it is in the paper form. But we'll see some examples of document templates from the paper age where there were gaps left for information to be filled in. Now, the virtue of these document templates is that it means that social institutions don't have to be reinvented every time somebody wants to take advantage of them afresh. They can just take the relevant document template and fill in the details. Then we have the document versus, and this is the olden days now, versus the piece of paper. Because while the piece of paper can be burned, it may be that the document survives because we have a copy. And so we should not assume that the document is in every case identical with the piece of paper. Sometimes it is. Sometimes if the paper document is destroyed, then the document is destroyed. This is true of your passport. Even if you keep a copy of your passport, if your passport is destroyed, you do not have a passport. You need to get a new one. But again, in the olden days, if your boarding pass for your airplane is destroyed, you can just print another one. So the boarding pass is not identical with the paper boarding pass. And that's true for many documents. So some documents like passports, identity cards, driver's licenses are distinct from copies, and other documents are such that any copy is equally valid with the original. Then we need to distinguish authentic documents from forgery. So you may have a forged passport, which is not a passport at all, but which you can use as a passport within certain circumstances. Now, we have document acts which include signing a document. Now, when you get your passport, you have to sign it, and that does at least three things. It initiates the validity, it attests to the truth, you agree with all the things in it. I bet you didn't check. And it provides a sample pattern of your signature, so that people can check whether you are really the person you claim to be. So we get 3 document acts, but 1 physical act of adding ink to a piece of paper. Now, then, once we have the passport, we can use it in all kinds of document acts. We can use it to prove who we are. We can use it to check who you are. We can use it to renew, in other words, to get a new passport. And we can use it in order to renounce our citizenship, or take away somebody else's citizenship, or restrict somebody else's movement. So I was recently in Saudi Arabia, and I passed the terminal where the Muslim pilgrims come to go to Mecca each year. And when they arrive at this terminal in the Jeddah airport, their passports are taken away, because they're not allowed to walk around in Saudi Arabia. They are only allowed to go to Mecca, walk around in Mecca, and then go back to the air terminal. So the passport is used to restrict the movement.
Sorry, how do they prove that they are the person with that particular passport on their
They have an identity. They have a special identity card
that they get when they turn in their passport?
Yeah. I got one of those for another reason in Saudi Arabia, and so I was living in a restricted zone very briefly, and everybody had to have a residence permit, and they typed out my residence permit, and they mistyped the year, and that they didn't notice. So I still have it, and my residence permit is guaranteed is valid for 18,000 years. All right, so now we come back to the De Soto thesis. So De Soto was particularly interested in the way in which title deeds for land or for buildings create property. So if you squat on a piece of land, you don't have property. You have control, you have power over the land to some degree, but you don't have property. To have property, you need something like title deeds. You need a record, you need documentation. Then stocks create capital, examination documents create PhDs, marriage licenses create bonds and matrimony, and so on. So all of these are ways in which documents create institutions. But we're talking now about document systems. The institutions are products of the representations, the records created by the documents in the document systems. And these are just some more examples. So documents create roles. So when you get your physician's license, you become a physician. Once you are a physician, you can create certain other documents, for instance, a sick note. And then we have a distinction between documents issued legally. For instance, when the physician who is a real authorized physician creates a sick note, as contrasted with documents created extra-legally, but which have consequences. So the US Declaration of Independence was a non-legal document. They didn't have the right to produce that document. But they produced it, and they managed to fool the world sufficiently that certain realities came into existence. Now that is very important, because something like that must have been the case for every single institution, because at the beginning there was no legal authority. All right, so this is a quote from Bill Clinton. So he was really impressed by what De Soto was able to do in order to counteract poverty. Now, another feature of De Soto's work, and I've helped him to some degree with this, is that if you want to understand how documents create the institutions of modern society, then you need to understand the history of those institutions. Because all of the various different kinds of document systems had to be created for the first time somewhere. Very often it was in medieval or Renaissance Italy, where many of the features of contemporary banking were first invented. Now what De Soto is trying to do is to reinvent that evolution of document systems rapidly in Africa and other parts of the world. And so I'll talk a little bit about what he did specifically in Tanzania. So in Tanzania, you have many poor villages, and you have a few big cities. The big cities have Western colonial law, British colonial law. But even in the villages, there are various institutions which we would recognize as legal or commercial institutions, and various kinds of documents to support those institutions. Everyone has cell phone. That's an extra legal cell phone renting kiosk where you can buy your prepaid cell phone time. And this is the office of the Mwenyekiti, which is Tanzania was a communist country for some time, and the Mwenyekiti were established by the communists. They are basically village chairmen or magistrates. They keep the documents. So you can't see here, but there are boxes and boxes full of documents. For instance, identification documents. So that's the stamp of the Mwenyekiti. That's the document template for an identity document. And there, the document template has been filled in with the name of this gentleman. That's his picture. That's the date when the document was created. It's been stamped again and signed and dated again. The picture has been stamped. So all of these are elements of a document which bring about certain documentary effects. You can identify the person in the identity document, for instance. And you can do it with cows too. So you can, the cow branding are ways of making cows identifiable as being your cows. And then you have California driver's licenses, which are roughly the same, really. You have a stamp and signatures and co-signatures. And these are the elders who are trying to resolve a dispute about parcel boundaries. They take evidence from witnesses and so forth to decide who owns which piece of land. And then they create a document like this, which includes a rudimentary title deed with a map showing where the boundaries between the different lands lie. And this document is created by the council of elders in the relevant village. The difference between a piece of land and property is that property can be set out in a written document with determinate meaning. That's a quote from De Soto. He taught the Peruvians to understand these things by going around and giving lectures to thousands of people. He gave sometimes lectures to 60,000 people who came to hear what these new pieces of paper could do. And he had cartoons printed with no words, just pictures, waving title deeds, cartoons of people waving title deeds to police and so forth, so that the people would learn the institutions of legal title who couldn't read. So, the Mwenyekiti keeps records of birth, deaths, contracts, and so on. He keeps records of registration documents. So he is the registrar. He is the person to whom you go if you need to check who owns what. And what this means is that you can protect against fraud and theft, but you can also mobilize assets to get mortgages. And these are the documents. So the documents are crisscrossed. They come in bundles, and each bundle will be documents relating to a certain set of institutional arrangements. And these bundles mirror the crisscross networks of documents mirror the network of legal and property relations between the people who are described in those documents and the land or factories or farms or whatever it might be, which the documents describe. Now, an important feature of all of these documents is that they have to be anchored to real stuff. So if you have a document documenting the value of a factory, you have to have some way of knowing that this document is about this factory. And similarly, if you have a bank account, you have to have some way of knowing that this is your bank account rather than someone else's bank account. And so this is why all the photographs get stamped, so that people can't take somebody else's bank account and get the money by switching out the photographs. And it's also why there are so many numbers here and so many stamps that signatures. So the signature here probably is just a thumbprint. Yes, thumbprints, because the people can't write. All right. So a photograph isn't sufficient. The photograph has to be marked in the right way. It has to be stamped and signed and countersigned in the right way. Now, how many people in the room know what the blockchain is? How many people have heard about Bitcoin? So the basis of Bitcoin is electronic money. It's created on the basis of an algorithm, and there is at any given time a limited number of Bitcoin which you can buy or sell, and so the value of Bitcoin goes up and down according to who wants to buy or sell it, and it's influenced also by the fact that people are creating new Bitcoins, but it gets harder and harder to create them as time goes by because the algorithm makes it harder. Now the way in which this is entirely open software-based creation of what you might think of as money. People do buy it for money and then use it as money. And the basis of it is something called the blockchain. And the blockchain basically is a gigantic record of everything that happens to any Bitcoin. So it's a distributed database, which means that there are many, many copies. And every time, and there's a certain protocol, so that the database is continuously growing and hardened against tampering and revision by the fact that every time a transaction takes place, many records of that transaction are spread across the network, and they become locked. This is why you say that we say blockchain. They become locked in the chain. You can't tamper with them once they're in there. So the blockchain guarantees on the side of this database that the transactions which have been performed are valid transactions. It makes it easy to check. Now, what De Soto wants to do next is to create title deeds using the same distributed blockchain paradigm, so that you won't just have a title deed as a piece of paper, which you might lose, with a photograph which has been stamped and signed and so forth, but you'll have something which is part of a tamper-proof record. And he's got Silicon Valley Bitcoin protocol experts to work with him to create a blockchain-based system of land title, which he's testing out I think in Peru. Now, I think gradually all kinds of property documents are going to drift towards something like the blockchain. The blockchain is practically free. It's practically secure. So in the early days of Bitcoin, there was some quite serious problems with interference and theft. But as time goes by, the technology of the blockchain is so well understood that ways have been found to secure it, which are much quicker than standard banking or record keeping or government registration protocols, but also free, practically speaking. So the blockchain is decentralized. There is no central manager of the blockchain. There are just many copies all over the world, and no one has control. So if you haven't heard about the blockchain, then you should find out about the blockchain. It really is an amazing... Now, before we had the blockchain, we needed to anchor things against tampering by using various kinds of document artifacts, fingerprints, official stamps, photographs, barcodes, brand marks on your cows, car license plates, policeman's badge again. All of these are ways in which you anchor the policeman, the badge number, the records of the policeman, the licenses of the policeman, the telephone number of the local police station. All of these are linked together in networks which bring about anchoring of this human being here to the power of the police that this human being, because he has this number and this badge, possesses. All right. Now this is an example of a standardized will. So it's a document template. One of the very earliest wills in Moshi, I think another place in Tanzania, which was made out by Helen Kiwali at the Lutheran Church in Moshi. So the Lutherans had sent out this template to all their churches so that people, for the first time, could create wills. Now, wills are a very good example of a document act because they only come into play when you're dead. So you can't remind people. With speech acts, it's too late. And having wills are if you're having the developed institutions of modern society, people are going to die rich. And so you want to be able to ensure that the people who die can take care of the distribution of their property before they die, and for that you need documents. And this is just one example of standardized forms. So standardized forms capture the memory of the species. So I don't know when the first wills were created, probably in Roman times or even before that. There were no wills in Tanzania until the Lutheran Church, or somebody like the Lutheran Church, created those templates. Those templates encapsulated thousands of years of history of how to make your wishes effective after your death. Then the will makes that possible also because the assets are defined in standardized ways. So in order to describe what you want to have happen to what you own after you die, you have to be able to describe what you own in such a way that people can find what you own and dispose of it in the appropriate way. So document systems help us to create who we are. Our relations to our children will be different if we have wills than if we do not have wills. The fact that we have a template for creating wills will determine how we understand what we own, how we keep records of what we own, how we track what we own, how other people view what we own. And, well, we talked about that. Now, that's all the good stuff. But of course, sometimes it all breaks down. So in 2007, somebody got a bank loan and bought this condo. Maybe you. And then they got the title deed to the condo and gave it to the bank so that they could get the loan. So the bank has the title deed. That's the security on the loan. You owe the bank $1 million. But you have a nice condo. But then in 2008, the Lehman crash brought about a reduction in property values in Florida and in other places, so that your condo is now worth only $500,000. So what do? You owe the bank $1 million. Your condo, if you tried to sell it, would only be worth $500,000. You still have to pay the mortgage off week by week. You walk away. And you give the keys, well, you push the keys through the letterbox. It's not your problem anymore, it's the bank's problem. Now, if that is happening to the bank 100,000 times, then the bank is going to go bankrupt, which is roughly what happened in 2008. So we're going to do the ontology of all of this. So these are some of the objects that we need to start to think about. So banks, condos are physical, sort of, although they are property, which means they're associated with documents. Then we have prices. What is a price? We have mortgages, we have mortgage contracts, we have signatures on mortgage contracts, we have your breaching of the mortgage contract, and we have the value of the mortgage. So the mortgage, just as the condo will change in value, so the mortgage will change in value, because mortgages can be bought and sold. Now, basic formal ontology is going to help us understand some of this. So first of all, we have the processes, which are in green. So there's the process of lending, there's the process of buying, there's a process of collapsing in value. So collapsing in value is, from a physical point of view, relatively painless, but it still hurts. And then you have you walking away and giving the keys back. That's occurrence. And then we have continuance. So the bank, the independent continuants are, well, I put the bank in red. We can come back to that. So the independent continuants, the physical things, are the condo, the keys, and that's about it. I guess even the signature is made of ink, but still. And then the bank, the price, the mortgage contract, that's not a piece of paper, because a copy of the mortgage contract will be equally valid if the original mortgage contract is burned or lost. A signature, the mortgage, a commitment to repay the mortgage, which is documented on another piece of paper. And then the same mortgage after the default, when it's become a quite different kind of object, because the original mortgage had a title deed associated with it, and it had a commitment to pay from the person who took out the mortgage. But now that person isn't going to pay anymore. So the mortgage value has immediately dropped. And then, so that's the dependent and independent continuums. Now, why is the bank a dependent continuum? Well, the bank is not the building. The bank is an institution. Now, what does that mean? It means it's not the building. What it means positively, we still have to do some work on deciding. So, anyway, we can come back to that if we have time. All right, so, and then in the aftermath, so we have all of these mortgages which are lower in value. These have been bundled into collateralized debt obligations. People bought these collateralized debt obligations before the crash. Some people then bundled the collateralized debt obligations into collateralized debt obligations squared, and then other people created collateralized debt obligations cubed. All of this was going on very rapidly. People were making lots of money selling these things, but they weren't keeping track of all of the documentable details that they should have been doing. So we have collateralized debt obligations to the nth degree. In 2008, all of this collapsed. How can you find out now what is the value of a mortgage? So the bank has many mortgages on its books. It really should have some money. The mortgages are not worth zero. They're still attached to condo. How can they find out? Because the mortgages have been bundled inside bundles, which have been bundled inside bundles. And the value trace at each bundling stage is not capable of being documented. And so part of the reason for the collapse was the inability of banks to work out how much collateral they owned, because the collateral was folded up inside these absurd bundles. And so this is a process of securitizing mortgages, bundling them into. It's not a simple process. I yearn for the day when the ontology of social reality will be able to do justice to something like that. So CDOs are continuant. Anyway. So what are you buying when you buy a CDO? You're not buying something physical. What you're buying is something like a mathematical structure with some kind of relationship to things like condos, the dispositions of owners of condos to pay back the mortgage, which will be a statistical thing. And what goes on with CDOs is that they get aggregated with other CDOs, or they get partitioned or repackaged and rebranded. So they're historical entities. They're not physical. Now, philosophers, since Plato, have tended to see the world as being made of two kinds of entities. The physical entities, which are in time, and the abstract entities, numbers or values or ideal types, which are outside time. But mathematics is outside time. Physics is inside time. But these things are inside time, but they're not physical. Now, a naturalist like Searle will say, well, that's easy. They don't exist. We just pretend that they exist. I don't think that's a good story if we want to understand the ontology of collateralized debt obligations. It's not good enough to say that they are just fantasies. But that's what Searle says, and we'll come back to that in a minute. All right, so let's go back to BFO. We have specifically dependent continuance. Can you read that? So the CDSOs are not mental entities. They're not physical entities. They're not abstract in the traditional sense because they're in time. But they're also, in some sense, normative entities. So we talked about obligations, and we talked about the problem of finding a place for obligations within BFO. They can be bought and sold. They can be aggregated. They can be stored in the same way that data is stored inside a computer. They can be divided up. They can be repackaged. Now, there's nowhere here where you can find entities which can be subject to all of those things. This is a piece published by De Soto in the Wall Street Journal on March the 25th, 2009, explaining how the crash was dependent upon lack of documentation of how the assets were bundled. And the reason why that was important was because when the crash occurred, it was very important for the government to find out very quickly which banks owed which other banks what monies. Because there were debts going in both directions. And if you can just find out who owes what to whom, if you can do that quickly, you can resolve all those debts. And the crash would have been relatively minimal. But they couldn't find out the information that they needed because there was no adequate documentation. So they had allowed these new creatures, the collateralized debt obligations and similar artifacts, to grow without keeping track of how they grew in such a way that the value of them could be assigned instantaneously whenever you needed to work out the values of the debts of given organization. So, we're dealing with something which is like a mathematical structure, but which is tied to time and change, and which has some kind of normative qualities. They're normative entities. And they're going to go somewhere here. They're going to be generically dependent rather than specifically dependent continuous. So we can say similar things about credit card numbers. So a credit card number is not a number because it's not a mathematical entity. Why not? Because it's tied to time. Your credit card number was created at a certain point in time when your credit card was created. And I don't mean the piece of plastic. I mean the institutional artifact, which you get one or more pieces of plastic still, which are associated with it. But the credit card itself is more like a mathematical entity. It's a mathematical entity which is tied to time and which has normative properties. It gives you the power to spend money. You have to pay back the money in due course, but still it gives you the power to spend money. And it's tied to huge worldwide systems for processing the instructions that you issue with its means. When you tell the shopkeeper or whomever it might be to charge your credit card certain amounts of money, that these are worldwide, because you can charge a credit card issued in the US when you're in Saudi Arabia, for instance. So they are generically dependent continuants. So that they're dependent continuants means that they depend upon physical reality. There has to be computers. There has to be institutions which manage and program the computer. They're generically dependent because they can be, that you can switch out the physical objects which are serving as their physical support. A bank may sell all credit card accounts that it owns to another bank. The credit card accounts stay the same, but now they're dependent on different computers in different buildings where the transactions are being performed. The fact that they are continuants means that they're tied to time. So they continue to exist through time. A credit card account or a collateralized debt obligation or just a simple debt exists through time. It doesn't have any molecules, so it's not an independent continuum. Now banks go there too, somehow. Credit cards, debts and so forth certainly go there. Credit card numbers also. And there's a little bit of rumination on credit card numbers. When you fill in your tax form, so you have a screen. I'm assuming that you use something like TurboTax to fill in your tax form. So you start with a web page, which is the modern day equivalent of the last will and testament template created by the Lutheran Church in Moishi. You have cells and you fill in data in those cells, and then you hit enter, and then you get the next web page and you fill in more data. Now what's happening here is mathematico-deontic. So you are as you enter more and more data, mathematical processes are generating some generically dependent continuum, which is your tax situation fragment as far as you've got in the course of entering all the data. And then finally you finish, and you hit enter, and then you hit send. And now you've performed a document act. You have sent the declaration to the tax office. You are now committed to the truth of everything in that declaration. So you have another dimension of normativity. So now we're performing a continuous series of document acts to create one document, which is your tax declaration, which is an electronic document. That document will go to the tax office and it will start to be processed, and it will generate it will become part of a document net with annotations created by tax officers who say there's something suspicious here, we need to check this. And then they'll go and check the bank documents which correspond to the entries on your 1099 int or whatever it is document about the interest that you seen and so forth. So the document that you send becomes part of a net of documents and becomes annotated so that it evolves through time. And so what I really would like to call this something like moving mathematics, but I'm not happy with this this name for it. What we're dealing with mathematical objects which change as a result of human actions. And now we'll see later on that these are freestanding Y structures. What this means is that they are structures which exist, but not because there is anything physical underneath. So they're freestanding. Why we call them Y structures will become clear in a minute. So they are some of these freestanding Y structures are tied to time. When you're filling in your tax data using TurboTax, the .tax file is a freestanding Y structure that changes in mathematical ways.
Has been reported in this building. For your safety, walk.
I think it's just a dialectical difference.
So I'm worse than the Platonist. I think that there are quasi-Platonic entities that are in time and have normative powers. So I'm sorry, there just are. And if you don't believe me, then probably I want you to lend me a lot of money, and then tomorrow I will declare that the debt is a fiction. There just are those things. We just need to know what they are. That's the job. All right, now, freestanding Y structures embody powers and duties. So they are trying to eliminate cash. They have a plan in Sweden that in 5 years there will not be any cash money. There'll just be computerized money. But then all the money, when there is just computerized money, will be such that it is able to give you the power to buy things. So whatever it is which is in computers, which sounds to me like a mathematical, magnetic affair, has to have this normative property that it gives you the power to buy things. And this is because the computers have been programmed in certain ways. All right, so is all of this, the next stage in this journey is, are we really dealing with anything new? Are document acts really not just speech acts, but speech acts accompanied by the assumption of extra powers of memory and greater trust? So let's suppose that with the development of genetics, we become ever more intelligent and ever more trustworthy and have ever more powerful memories. So that we don't need computers, we don't need dollar bills. We all know always how much we each own, and everyone trusts us when we say how much we own. We don't need cash money, we just have speech acts. Speech acts, memories, and trust would be enough to do all of the things, however complicated, that we do now by using things like dollar bills, credit cards, bills and receipts, and statements of account, and so forth. So all of these things that we do now, signing, counterstamping, sealing, ratifying, registering, all of these things would become redundant because we all trust each other and we have perfect memories. So is there anything genuinely new here, which is not just a trivial extension of what we would have from speech acts in a world like that? And I think this is analogous to the question whether you could play a blind poker game. So we know that you can play blind chess. People with very good memories and very intelligent people who trust each other play blind chess. They don't have any props. They don't have any documents. They're doing something which is also quasi-mathematical by exchanging speech acts. And they know who's won the game, and they both agree who's won the game because they've been following the game in their minds. But there's nothing other than speech acts and what goes on in their minds. Now, could we have a blind poker game? A poker game in which there are no props. No cards, no dollars, no table where you lay down your bets. I claim that there could not. So the big difference is that in chess, everything is open. And in poker, you mask your cards. And you're supposed to bluff. In other words, you're supposed to be not trustworthy. You're not playing the game unless you bluff, or unless people think you might be bluffing. And so if trust cannot be relied upon, and if there are no props, then there would be no way in which a poker game could be simulated under conditions where there are no props. Now, what we have in the various kinds of activities with standardized transactions involving credit cards, or in the processes involved in complex court cases where people collect documents by interviewing witnesses, recording the interviews, compiling the documents, summarizing the documents, and so forth. Those kinds of props make possible very complicated legal processes, which would be impossible if in a world in which there were no props. Not just hard to simulate because it would require a lot of memory, impossible. And so the argument is that what we have to deal with here is something genuinely distinct from a world with speech acts and enhanced memory and trust. Now, let's go back to document templates. So I said that document templates allow what has been learned through what may be thousands of years of civilization to be encapsulated in a very, very simple checklist kind of artifact, so that people can draw the benefits of what has been learned through the experience of the institution of wills over many years, and create a will in 5 minutes which will have the same effects as wills that have been created by other people who are in the process of perfecting the institution. The idea is that the will template is so effective because you don't have to think about it. You don't have to know anything about the institution of will. You just have to answer the questions step by step. Just as TurboTax is effective because you don't have to do all the arithmetic which is involved in entering your tax data to the tax authorities, because TurboTax will do it for you. Now, I think this is another sense in which document act theory is capturing something essentially new as compared with what speech act theory was documenting when it was concerning itself with simple speech act situations in small village societies. Document acts enable people in small village societies to take advantage of sophisticated, developed institutions without having to know all of the machinery which has been developed over generations, which went into the creation of those institutions. And now, this is a passage from A.N. Whitehead. It is an erroneous truism that we should cultivate the habit of thinking what we are doing. The precise opposite is the case. Civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking about them. Now, documents extend the number of important operations we can perform without thinking about them, and create things which are essentially new. Things like insurance, things like property rights, things like bankruptcy. These are institutions which can only exist in a world with documents. And when we move from documents in the paper sense to documents in the electronic sense, then we get an even more rapid advance of civilization, or anyway, of things which are essentially new. So, standardized documents enable stocks, they enable pensions, they enable new types of, we talked about legal accountability, they enable new types of massive planning, of gigantic concerts, or of new road systems, or of new kinds of architecture, new kinds of plumbing, new kinds of emergency response system when there is a fire alarm. They enable things like democracy in a large society. So democracy based on gestures and speech is possible only in a small society. It won't work in a society with millions of people, and so on. So all of these are made possible not just by documents, actually, but by standardized documents. So this is the De Soto thesis, extended beyond capitalism to democracy and the law. All right, so the Holy Roman Empire and so on. So this is speech act theory. What we can do with words, we can describe, command, promise, congratulate. With documents, we can do things like create chemical diagrams, create maps, create blueprints, musical scores, plans of battle, flowcharts, acts of parliament. So some of this is just an intensification, enhancement of what we find in the realm of speech acts, but some of it is essentially new. This is a Hungarian certificate for a doctorate. signed by His Magnificence the Rector, but it's in Hungarian. That side is in Latin, I think. All right. Now, I talked about blueprints a minute ago. John Searle talks about directions of fit. And one of the ways in which he classifies speech acts has to do with the direction of fit, whether it's from world to mind or from mind to world. So, I promise I will mow your lawn tomorrow. The direction of fit goes from world to mind. The world has to make this realized, has to fulfill this promise. Namely, I have to mow your lawn tomorrow. So you and I exchange, we communicate, our minds become registered in a certain way. In order for that registration to become realized, the world has to change. So it's a world to mind direction of fit. Mind to world is, I see, that's the mind, that my lawn has been mowed. So the direction of fit is from mind to world. And then there are cases where there is automatic mind to world and world to mind direction of fit. And this would be an example like, I promise to pay you $100, and I thereby, by promising, make it true that I just promised to pay you $100. So when I say it, it becomes true, and when it becomes true, I say it. It's automatic. So there are these three kinds of direction of fit. Now, how does this work for documents? So a plan is a document which is formulated to change the world, to make the world conform to the mind of the planner. If the world does conform to the mind of the planner, then we have fit. Mind to world, a report is published evaluating the success of the execution of the plan. So that's mind to world direction of fit. We see that the plan was successfully executed. And then automatic mind to world, world to mind direction of fit. An act of parliament is declared that such and such is the law, and automatically such and such is the law. All right? Now, musical directions of fit, because music is all about documents. So there is world to score direction of fit. The score tells the world how to be musically. And then the orchestra does it, so that there is world to score direction of fit. The world fits the score. And then score to world direction of fit is a music student is listening to the performance and annotating the score when they make a mistake. And then their score to world direction of fit, because the score fits the performance. And then there is automatic score to world and world to score. Berlioz completes the score and thereby brings into being a work that is precisely conformant to the score, automatically. No extra step is needed. All you need is a Berlioz. Now, this is what happens when we plan a journey. So we go to Google Maps, and we enter our starting point and our exit point, and then we have a score of our journey, or the plan of our journey, the document. This is the document. And it starts as a plan because we haven't fitted the world to the document. But once we've fitted the world to the document, we can look at our map and say, this is what I did this morning. And then we have mind to world direction of fit, or map to world direction of fit. So before we go walking, it's world to map direction of fit. After we go walking, it's map to world direction of fit. And then we want to build a house. So this is a blueprint. We're going to have world to map, world to blueprint direction of fit. It starts as a plan, and it's going to end as a record. And it will be a record both of the process, because as the plan gets executed, the blueprint will change, because we'll discover that there is an oil well or something just where we wanted to put the baby's room. So this will be a record of the process and of the product, because the house should look a bit like this. So, now, as I have said already several times, in the traditional Searle and so forth literature, people like to deal with simple local speech acts. So people are going to dance or have a barbecue. But there are also acts of massively shared agency. And there is a very nice paper with this title by a philosopher of law called Scott Shapiro. He criticizes Searle and co. because they have largely concentrated on analyzing shared activities among highly committed participants. So if you're singing a duet, you're probably committed to the process. There won't be any dispute. So you don't care about whether you remember your commitments because disputes about commitments never arise, typically. But if you are establishing a factory with thousands of employees, or if you're planning a military campaign with tens of thousands of soldiers, then speech acts are not going to be enough. And that's why large organizations have so much bureaucracy and produce so many documents, because the commands which are being set forth and which are being transmitted down the chain of command have to be documented in appropriate ways. And you have to have documents also about how you will punish those people who do not fulfill their obligations. And you'll have documents about how you will appoint people who will be instructed in such a way that they will fulfill their operations and so on. And according to Shapiro, these documents and the associated authority relations which they make possible by documenting the duties and so forth of the holders of specific offices are mesh-creating mechanisms. In other words, they are what enable massively shared agency to evolve out of the meshing of the actions of many different people playing many different roles. The documents are needed to create the necessary meshing between the actions of the different participants. And this is true even in a simple orchestra, where the actions of the violinists need to mesh with the actions of the piccolo players, piccolists. So documents plus authority are what make possible massively shared agency, whether this is universities or religions or legal systems or armies. Now, I'm not going to talk about literature. That's moving mathematics again. So software, I did make it. So we have credit card accounts and we have laws and we have they'll do to start with. So they're both characterized by the following features. They have a beginning to exist. This beginning to exist involves the creation and completion of documents, and then they continue to exist and they change step by step over time. So the credit card account changes because sometimes it has money amounts associated with it because the credit card holder has been incurring debts, and sometimes it has a zero balance and so on. So it has a life. And similarly, a law is created, an act of parliament, the law is published, it becomes, with the publication of the law, it becomes effective. And then it changes over time because it's implemented, it's applied in various different cases. A case law literature grows up around it as people discover that there are certain words in the law which don't have quite clear meanings, or the words which did have quite clear meanings no longer can be applied because the world has changed. And so the law gets revised, or it gets associated with case law amendations so that people know how to behave in certain circumstances when they get cases which are subject to the law but which don't quite fit. So the law has a life. Now, but the law and the credit card account are not physical entities. They are generically dependent continuants. They depend upon the existence of documents, and on the existence of expertise of the people who know how to read and apply those documents. But which documents and which people are required for the existence of the law changes with generation to generation. Now, similarly, the credit card account, as we already saw, is a generically dependent continuum because it might be moved from one bank and one set of servers to another bank. Now, what about software? So we'll take a computer program, and there are various levels we can do this at, but we'll start with Microsoft Word. Version 1, I guess there was a version 1. That was created by human beings. It's a kind of literary creation. And it's different from a work of literature because it has to execute, it has to do something. But still, it's created by processes very similar to the process of creating a work of literature. It's actually more similar to creating a musical score, an orchestral score, where all the pieces have to be meshed together when they follow the instructions in the score. Microsoft Word, it's executed in something like the way that a musical score is performed. I'm safe. Now, the software will change over time. And the easiest case to deal with is Microsoft Word is revised and becomes Microsoft Word 1.1, or Microsoft Word 2, or Microsoft Word 2000, or Microsoft Word 2010. What's the current one called? Microsoft 2016. So we're dealing with an object which is not physical, which is created in time, and which changes over time. All of that sounds to me as if it's true.
Why would you say it's not physical?
So which one are you talking about now? The law, the score, the credit card account, or the software?
Are you just saying because it's safe on a hard drive, or server farms on Seattle?
So Microsoft Word 2016 exists in many different places.
Yes.
And it's not made of molecules. No. It's something like a it's something like a pattern, isn't it? A human created pattern.
All right.
Okay, now it's a human created pattern which could in principle be instantiated outside electromagnetic server, like you could print it, yeah.
Yeah, you can print it.
So the very same pattern can exist in two very different forms, media. Now that doesn't sound to me as if the pattern is something physical.
All right.
So,
Physical.
It's
a pattern physical.
It's a pattern which is realized in the ways in which magnetic excitations on surfaces or ink patterns on printed out versions are structured.
Okay, but she seems just the distinction between type and tokens that we know for books and right, the distinction between the novel and the physical book.
Okay, now types are not physical.
No, that's
okay.
So that's the distinction you're making.
Yes. I don't like to use the word type because it's used in so many ways. Yes.
You're dealing with the executed code and the programmed code the same way. A software, we codify a software. We can read, looks like
Yeah.
a language,
Yeah.
like or the OL, but we can have the executable code.
Yes.
That the execute does
So
not
it's-
make sense to have the executed outside the computer. The
Good.
code-
Okay. So that's a difference. I guess that if we printed out Microsoft Word 2016 on paper, we could not execute that particular token of Microsoft Word 2016.
Oh,
Not directly,
Well,
anyway.
It's more complicated than that because the thing we could print out, the thing people name, is going to be in some language.
Yeah.
Then the thing which is executed is something completely different.
Yeah, so that,
Because you have a compiling step.
Yeah. So that's why I said that there are various levels at which we can address this issue. So on some levels, Microsoft Word and Microsoft Word 1.1 are not the same piece of software. But given what you say and leaving aside these compiler-related issues, is it not the case that everything that you just said applies also to a musical score? A musical score is written by somebody who knows a certain code and writes the score, which is then executed by people who perform the score. The code is written, the software is written by people who know how to use a certain code. They write the code, and then the code can be executed by the computer. I think there are very deep similarities between musical scores and pieces of software. Yes?
So software, operation system, database, these entities should belong to
Generically dependent continuum.
Yeah. So what's the difference between generically dependent continuant and specifically dependent?
So a specifically dependent continuant is specifically dependent on some one host or bearer. So let's suppose that you program your computer with a version of, with a copy of Microsoft Word 2016, which you download from the web. Then you create on your computer a certain pattern, which is actually there in the magnetized disks on your computer. That is a specifically dependent continuum. It's tied to your computer. And now you might download Microsoft Word 2016 on a second computer. That's a second specifically dependent continuum. But there's only one generically dependent continuum, which is concretized here and concretized there. So the generically dependent continuum is that which is copyable. It's the pattern which can exist in many different copies. And that pattern is not physical, I'm saying. All right. So these are some standard definitions. They seem to comport to my analogy with a musical score.
Wouldn't be the better analogy something like an instruction in a copy?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because in a music score, it doesn't really tell you, right? It's just there. It's not. It doesn't have a normative.
Oh, it does.
But it doesn't say make me.
But neither does it.
Make me perform.
Neither does a recipe in a recipe book.
All right. So it has more. I mean, the computer program really has an instruction which the computer.
So molto fortissimo or something. That's an instruction.
Okay.
And then hit this one, and then hit this one, and then go piccolo.
Let's see. Yeah.
So I rest my case. It's all written down here. But the fact that I write my case on a screen doesn't mean that I proved my case. So all of these things are also analogous to what we find in.
Another doubt. You explained the specifically dependent and generically dependent.
Yeah.
But in this case, the copy in this computer, they don't are instance of the same.
They are concretizations of the same pattern. Now, let me see if I can clarify what I mean here. So, let's suppose that you have a copy of Tolstoy's War and Peace, and a second copy with a slightly different font, but the pagination is the same. Then it's the same pattern, which is being concretized. Now here. So the pattern, Tolstoy's War and Peace in Cyrillic script, let's say, is concretized here in a 461-page, 10-point font version, and here in a 461 page, 11-point font version, because the pages are a bit bigger. But now let's suppose that you concretize it using 15-point font so that it's 600 pages long. It's still the same pattern.
Yeah,
It just looks different.
yeah, but in software is different. I can download the software
Yeah,
in two computers.
yeah,
Install in two computers.
yeah,
And the source
yes,
was the same.
yes,
And the installation, I have the concretized of this
Yeah.
case, but they don't have the instance in this case.
Why? What's the difference between what you get on your two computers when you install it? Give me an example of the kind of difference that you get.
They don't have a difference.
So then what's your point? That if it's the same pattern which is being concretized here and here, then the account is correct. We have the generically dependent continuum which gets concretized here with a specifically dependent pattern on this laptop, and here with a specifically dependent continuum pattern on that laptop. So that's
Okay, but if I get this copy and put in another,
yes,
the software I download
yeah,
and I can copy this
Yeah,
to another.
yeah.
It's the same.
yeah, absolutely. It's the same generically dependent continuum concretized in all copies. And there are many copies of Microsoft Word 2016. It's all the same. That's a generically dependent continuum. All right, so
They are specific because, for example, the key, the key to enable to
yeah, so there would be differences at that level also. So this is just repeating what I said earlier. So software execution may be analogous to theatrical performance. And in a theater, a dramatic work will contain explicit instructions telling people where to put their feet and things. So we have different kinds of executable entities. We have works of literature, works of music, works of drama, recipes, choreographic script, film script, service books for religious rites, route plans for funeral processions, and software. So software are executables. And so this is my conclusion.
the software could be also a concretization of a document. Because we writing software based on requirement,
You're writing software?
based in some requirement.
Yes.
Requirement could be a description that person say about how
Yeah.
they work. But
Yeah.
It could be a document. For example, a law.
Okay, but you would need to add some more ingredients. You couldn't just take the document. You have to make the document executable.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. No, the software can have many kinds of inputs. So you could have software that takes music as an input and turns it into strings. Fabian?
Yeah.
Is DNA an executable entity?
I'm afraid yes.
All right.
Why?
No, because we have been talking about artifacts so far.
Yeah, so there are two kinds of generically dependent continuants. There are artifacts, such as software, literature, and so forth, and then there are DNA sequences and chromosome sequences and similar entities, on the other hand, which are not artifacts. They are naturally occurring. But they do many of these things. They have a starting point in time. They create copies. The copies are created through a process which we can recognize as one of execution. We learn more and more about the details of that process all the time.
Yeah, no, it was just a question whether you consider.
Yeah. No, the origin of the theory of generically dependent continuance was in creating an ontology of information artifacts, which And we realized that what we wanted to say about information artifacts could also be said about DNA sequences, and that therefore DNA sequences are generically dependent continuum. All right.
Could you return in the this? Can a machine could be a executable entity?
A machine?
A machine, for example, because the machine could realize a human activity.
So there is a
robot, for example, it's a machine.
a robot.
Yeah, it's a machine with a software. Or
Okay. If the machine has software, then the machine can be regarded as being an executable, but that's because it has software. So its executableness is dependent upon its software, because there has to be executable. You have to have something which is realizable, something which is a disposition, and a machine is not a disposition; it's just a thing.
We can have some kind of activities that is by hardware and not by software.
For instance,
A water pump, for example.
yes.
Then realize that activity to put water
Okay,
in a box, for example.
Okay, so the water pump, let's suppose it's driven by software. Then the software executes by driving the activities of the pump. And the thermostat has software, and the software executes by driving the activities of the thermostat. So I think that what you're saying is that software can be used to drive a lot of hardware. But the hardware itself can't drive itself.
Yeah.
Yes?
So I just said before, if I copy Microsoft Word into another computer, then it should be a specifically dependent continuum.
The result of copying is a specifically dependent continuum. The starting point of copying is a specifically dependent continuum. But what gets copied is the pattern, and that's a generically dependent continuum.
We copy a pattern.
Yeah,
This pattern, this original software should be a genetically dependent continuum.
yeah.
So-
The generically dependent continuum is that which gets copied. And that's a pattern. That's a good way of thinking of it.
So if the copied software is a specific dependent
Yeah.
continuum, then it should be a quality or realizable entity.
Yeah. So the specifically dependent continuum, which is the software as it exists on the laptop hard drive, is a quality. It's a complex quality of magnetic excitation. So it's a distributed quality which includes sub-qualities, which we can think of very, very crudely as being either on or off at different nodes within a server array. Something like that. So that pattern can be copied. And you can have another pattern, an equivalent pattern on another server. But what is common across the two is generic rather than specific. Okay, yes?
So we can make computers and program those computers to do software within software.
Yes.
So, for example, if somebody does something like build a Turing machine inside of a video game like Minecraft,
Yeah.
is the software we put onto the Turing machine specifically dependent, generically dependent? It seems
Okay.
like we're building generically dependent software out of generically
Yeah.
dependent
So
entities.
I thought you were going to have a more interesting question. Or anyway, a question with a. So the reason why your question is not interesting is because my answer is not interesting. So I do not believe in works of fiction. I do not believe that there are things created within Minecraft. There are just. I don't know anything about Minecraft, incidentally, but I'm guessing now. It's just fictions. Fictions don't exist. So there is no Turing machine there. So give me an example where software is indeed created and the software creates more software inside it that doesn't involve fiction.
Well, I mean, if you want a less fictional example, we create virtual machines all the time.
Yeah, virtual and fictional are the same. I don't believe in virtual reality. When you are engaging with a virtual reality machine, there is nothing there. You just think there is. It's a delusion, or.
So what he means by virtual machine is basically simulation, the software simulation.
Okay, I get it. Good.
Of another machine.
Yeah,
and you
good.
can execute programs in there.
Yeah.
If you don't,
Okay.
and if you don't believe it, I have one of my laptops.
No, I believe this one. So, I don't see why that is really a problem for the view I'm taking. So, let's do the musical case. Let's suppose somebody writes an opera within which somebody, which has as its hero a musical composer who is writing an opera. Shakespeare did this, didn't he? Hamlet even. Hamlet has a little play inside it. It's not. So this is software. It has a little software inside it.
But a compiler is a software that creates software.
Yeah, so it's not a problem from my view. It just means that, well, I guess that another analogy would be an orchestra which has another orchestra reacting to the first orchestra, a smaller. There are pieces of music which will work like that.
So I think it's easier really, because it's still the same pattern. It's still the same pattern. So that's the same. I have this computer and it's a Mac. So I have Word on a Mac. Now I can have a virtual box in there which simulates PC, right? The Microsoft operating system. And I can install in this virtual machine Word, the same Word version.
Yeah.
Similar version, Word 2016,
Yeah.
whatever the right. Yeah. So now you have both installations of Word, instantiations of the dependent continuous.
Yeah.
So it's just it's the same pattern.
Yeah. So I don't see it.
Difficulty
Yeah.
for you.
So let's move on to what may be a difficulty. So is it not true that I am ignoring what makes software rather than music or cookery, namely the mathematical features of software? So I don't know whether I want to keep to this. So this is just a question. I don't have any answer. So now, finally, unless we have more questions. No? Yes?
If you don't mind.
No, please.
What was supposed to be the relationship? We initially talked about debts and, I guess, CDO.
Yeah?
Were those supposed to be in the same ontological category
Yeah.
as the later things we
Yeah.
discussed?
Yeah.
The software and
Yeah.
the scores?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a lot to be said about different kinds of generically dependent continuance. Executable generically dependent continuance are based on dispositions which are realized through executions, where debts are, well, I guess debts are related to dispositions, but the story there is more complicated. But they are generically dependent continuance because you can sell your debts, or you can give your debts to someone else if you can persuade that someone else to take them.
Was the initial puzzle supposed to apply to the software and the music score? Like, then the puzzle I'm referring to is the debt doesn't seem to be neither physical nor mental, nor purely mathematical or abstract. Was that ontological puzzle supposed
So let me
also be a problem for-
let me summarize the puzzle in terms of what Searle says. So in his book Making the Social World, Searle tries to resolve certain problems in his ontology of social reality. So in his earlier book, which is called The Construction of Social Reality, he says that we can develop a theory of social objects by viewing these social objects according to the formula X counts as Y in context C. So a cathedral is to be understood as a building which counts as a religious building in the religious context. A piece of plastic is a driver's license because this piece of plastic counts as a license to drive in California. A dollar bill is a social object because this piece of paper counts as a dollar bill in the United States. So X counts as Y in context C. It's the key to social ontology according to Searle. I pointed out, and in this way I became slightly famous, that Searle's formula doesn't work for debts. Because I have a debt, so what is the X which counts as the debt in the context of United States banking? Because there is nothing physical. For Searle, the X term has always to be something physical. There is no X term. So I coined the phrase freestanding Y term. And a freestanding Y term is a Y term in the formula without an X term. And if you think about it, nearly all the really interesting kinds of social objects, rights, debts, obligations, duties, permissions, and so forth, responsibilities, they're all freestanding Y terms. So Searle's own formula fails for practically all of social reality. Now, this was somewhat embarrassing. In fact, the first chapter of Making the Social World is a response to my criticism. And the ending point, which is, I find embarrassing, the final chapter, is his solution. And his solution, it's expressed in terms of money, but it would apply to these other things as well. I'll be talking about this next week. That money doesn't exist. Money is just a massive fantasy. There is no such thing as money. So you can give me all your money, and you won't have lost anything. I think this is a massive mistake on Searle's part. Now, this mistake is made because a philosopher like Searle, who is rooted in a physics-oriented culture, thinks that everything real has to be part of physics, or it's going to be just mathematical. But money is not part of physics. The theory of money is not the theory of dollar bills, which are part of physics. The theory of money is more complicated than that, and money exists, therefore Searle's theory is wrong. It's a great theory, but it's wrong. And now, did that answer your question?
I was wondering if software and musical scores are supposed to also be the Y.
So, good. So, for each of the examples I gave, maybe I can go through the list. So, the work of literature is a freestanding Y term. So, the copy is a physical object. And the copy may be a social object because the X, which is the copy, may count in English literary circles as a copy of this novel. But the novel itself is not the copy. The novel it's a generically dependent thing. It's not based on one physical entity like the driver's license or the cathedral or the president or the king. It's a freestanding Y term. And similarly with the work of music, so the performance is physical, the score typically is physical. Copies of the score are physical anyway. But the work is not physical. It's weird, it's a queer entity. But it exists, there are works of music. And then, similarly with drama, I won't do cookery, I won't do choreography, I won't do film. We don't have time for religion. So, So a lot of other examples can be treated in the same way.
No,
I had my last follow-up. So I just want to make all those clarifications. And then so my I guess my real question would be, or maybe some sort of counterexample or attempt at a counterexample would be, so it seems like we motivated the idea of a Y term or a freestanding Y term by saying, look, it doesn't fall into these traditional ontological categories.
Yep.
It's neither concrete nor abstract. And we get the example of debt, but it seems like some of these, like a score or a piece of software, could be accounted for with, you have the physical pieces of things on which they're written, but then it seems like if you supplement with that with abstract ontology, then you have the score and the software. I guess if you talk about the pattern,
Yeah.
constitutes the software. It seems like that is a case where you have
where that's an abstract object, and you don't. It doesn't really have that same problem as the debt, because it's not clear how you make sense of a debt in terms of abstractive, but it seems like you could in terms of
Okay,
a
so
graph. That's not the
Searle can accept certain kinds of abstract entities, basically the entities of mathematics. So Searle could accept, in order to do physics, you need to assume that there are such things as abelian groups and so forth. But they're not part of physical reality, but they do exist in the sense that they're needed to do physics. But we're not talking about abstract entities now. A musical score or a novel is a better case. A novel is not an abstract entity. It's a historical entity. It was created by a human being. It's not like an abelian group or Pythagoras' theorem. It's like the Mona Lisa or the Statue of David. It was created by an artist. It just happens to be not made of molecules. So I don't believe that there is a route out of this conundrum for Searle. People have suggested that the way out is to take the physical scores or the physical copies of the novel and say that the X term here is the copies, that they're physical. So this copy counts as the novel. But that's not true. No one mistakes the copy for the novel. And the proposal has not been made in terms of copies of novels, because there is obviously wrong. It's been made for the debts, for instance. So the debt is the IOU. The IOU counts as the debt, and that won't work. Sounds plausible, but it won't work. And the reason why it won't work is because you can burn the IOU and the debt is still there. Although you might want not to burn your IOUs. Yes?
So you briefly kind of nodded at a potential issue where it seems like you have physical and non-physical interacting at this point, right? It seems like that's unavoidable based on being committed to the real physical things that are historical entities. It seems like people who are really hardline monists would take real issue with that. So is there like a sort of a sketch?
So that I have to tell a plausible story which goes something like this. By taking the physical score, training his performers to execute the score, follow the instructions in the score, the conductor is able to create a performance which captures, which is done justice to, or which realizes the work as the author intended it. The work is not physical. How do we access the work? Well, not by having some kind of interaction between a physical thing, namely our ears, and a non-physical thing, namely the work of music, but rather by having our ears interact with the physical thing, which is the process of performance. So the interactions are always between physical and physical, but the entities are, in some cases, non-physical. And this applies to musical works, and it applies to debts. And it applies to money in the case of computerized money. And another example would be a blind chess game. The players in the blind chess game are interacting with a non-physical entity, namely the game, through physical entities, namely processes of speech that they hear when the other player plays.
So the same type of story would be told about like a computerized water pump or something like that, right?
Yes.
So it's
the software that executes is always a specifically dependent continuum, which means it's a real magnetic pattern which is interacting physically with other real physical things inside the machine. So all the interactions are non-weird, but those non-weird interactions enable us to apprehend things like works of music and debts. I hope that's not another emergency. All right, yes?
Just one question about this sort of theory, and I wanted to ask you if when the sort of talks about this future of capitalist societies and democracies, where there is this proliferation of documents, does he mean that a good working democracy or capitalist society has a lot of documents, or that it is features or a special feature of democracy or capitalist societies having these documents? Because I can think of tyrannical regimes
Yeah.
or not capitalist.
Yeah, so I have been looking on the bright side of document life. There are also dark sides of document life. So communist dictatorships had lots of documents. That didn't mean that they were models of Western civilization. So it's not just having a lot of documents, it's having document systems which work in the right sorts of ways. And I haven't said anything about that. He has said things about that, particularly describing the Lehman collapse. So they have to be documents which enable transparency. Okay, I think we'll call it a day.